Eva Schestag. Eva Schestag est allemande, elle vit et travaille à Francfort-sur-Main et est traductrice littéraire du chinois et de l'anglais vers l'allemand. Elle a étudié la littérature et la philosophie chinoise classique et moderne, ainsi que la littérature et la linguistique anglaise et américaine dans les universités de Munich, Nanjing, Zurich et Taipei. Elle traduit de la prose et de la poésie chinoise, tant classiques que modernes. Elle traduit également des reportages littéraires anglais. Parmi les auteurs qu'elle a traduits figurent l'artiste Ai Weiwei, le journaliste Mark Arax et Can Xue, candidate au prix Nobel. Eva a occupé plusieurs postes de chargée de cours invitée à l'Institut de littérature comparée de l'Université de Francfort. Et en 2025, elle s'est vue décerner la chaire Monika Schoeller pour la traduction littéraire par l'Université Goethe à Francfort.
Merci beaucoup, Sophie. Bonsoir. Et je continue en anglais. I'm full of bird songs. I'm full of bird songs is a line from a poem by the 8th century Chinese literati Meng Hao Ran in the translation of the Beat Generation American poet Gary Snyder. This line could just as well be the motto of our residency here at Château de Lavigny. The seclusion and retreat from everyday life allows us to listen to voices that we usually do not hear in the hustle and bustle of the cities we come from. I'm full of bird songs. If I translated this verse into German, it could read, Ich bin voll Vogelsang. Looking at the Chinese poem, however, the most striking difference to the English translation is the absence of an I. Gary Snyder simply assumes an underlying lyrical subject. He does that unobtrusively, beautifully, strikingly, but still seems to run counter to the philosophical substance of the poem, in which man and nature become one, and subject and object are no longer divided. As translators, we here find ourselves in a dilemma. An English or a German sentence needs a grammatical subject in order to be correct, whereas a classical Chinese sentence does not. The author of the Chinese poem is absent, has somehow dissolved in the verse without leaving a trace other than the poem. This is not to criticize Gary Snyder's translation of that line. On the contrary, I love it and think it is poetic, present, powerful, and beautifully surprising, because Snyder avoids being lengthy and overloaded or ornamental. In a certain way, his verse, I'm full of bird songs, does transcend the division between subject and object too, by incorporating one into the other. In so doing, he breaks with the image of Chinese poetry to be walking on magical princess feet, or of being infused with peach blossom scent, as the expressionist Austrian writer Albert Ehrenstein cynically described translations that he considered to be mere chinoiserie. This is just to give you a sense of the choices and reflections involved in translating from a language such as classical Chinese, which is radically different from ours, in particular poetry. In the Chinese original, the above 5-syllable line reads as follows. 221 Tiniao. Überall zwitschert's. I translate poetry and prose into German. My current project is the translation of a novel by Can Xue, a Chinese contemporary writer of whom Susan Sontag once said, if China has one possibility of a Nobel laureate, it is Can Xue. Can Xue is the leading writer of experimental literary avant-garde in China. The title of the novel I'm translating is 最后的情人, Die letzten Liebenden, The Last Lovers. That's the book. The plot is set in a country called A, which presumably is meant to stand for America. One of the many protagonists in the novel, whose lives are all narrated in parallel and whose wanderings intersect in various ways, by way of dreams, memories, visions, desire, or other real or imaginary encounters, is Joe. Qu'elle war der Name des Bekleidungsunternehmens, in dem Joe als Sales Manager arbeitete. Er war auf dem Weg zur Arbeit und wand sich mit einer Aktentasche unter dem Arm durch die engen Gassen. Qu'elle was the name of the clothing company where Joe worked as a sales manager. He was on his way to the office, weaving through the narrow alleys with a briefcase under his arm. This is the first sentence of the novel, which so emphatically starts with the Turkish word gül, which means rose. A Chinese novel set in the United States, starting with a Turkish word. The mishmash of cultures, nationalities, and types of characters is a pattern underlying and overlaying the whole text. It was important for me to keep that striking opening also in the translation, and it required some fiddling with the German word order and sentence structure to make it work. If I started the first sentence with Joe, for example, or translated Qu'elle into rose, the beginning of the novel would lose its power and force. Joe is a maniacal reader, and for years he has been reading one book after the other, so that all kinds of stories are intermingling in his head. When he sits in his office, he always hides a novel among the documents on his desk and pretends to be working while reading long and short stories and tales. A few lines further down, the novel continues. Vor einem Jahr hatte Joe begonnen, einen riesengroßen Plan zu entwerfen. Er wollte sämtliche Romane und Erzählungen, die er in seinem Leben gelesen hatte, noch einmal lesen, um sie alle miteinander zu verspannen. Auf diese Weise brauchte er nur ein Buch zur Hand zu nehmen und konnte sich nahtlos von einer Geschichte in die nächste begeben. Und er selbst würde sich darein verwickeln und von der Außenwelt nicht im geringsten stören lassen. A year ago, Joe had begun to conceive a huge plan. He wanted to reread all novels and stories he had ever read in his life in order to thread them all together. That way, he just needed to pick up a book and could seamlessly move from one story into the next, and he himself would get entangled in it and no longer be bothered by the outside world. From its very outset, the novel intertwines the real world and the world of literature, blurs the factual and the fictional. This border that we usually acknowledge and confirm on the basis of reason and logic is suspended throughout the book. All of a sudden, everything is possible and imaginable, and the plot develops erratically at a breathtaking pace. Let me add a side note on my choice of the uncommon word verspannen, which in the paragraph cited above translates the Chinese character guantong, meaning to thread or string together, to connect. My first encounter with this particular word was in Walter Benjamin's enigmatic essay Lehre vom Ähnlichen, Doctrine of the Similar of 1933. I don't want to go into the details of Benjamin's almost mystical text, but his notion of non-sensual similarity, unsinnliche Ähnlichkeit, that he introduces and elaborates there is interesting in the context of translation. As the physical body of the original is completely lost in any translation, it is intuitively appealing to describe the correspondence between a text and its recreation in another language in terms of a non-sensual similarity, unsinnliche Ähnlichkeit. In this context, Benjamin calls the relationship between the spoken word and what is meant, as well as the relationship between the written word and what is meant, as well as between the spoken and the written word, Verspannung, which in its literal sense comes very close to the meaning of the Chinese guantong and the image of a thread connecting disparate elements and thereby creating a texture. When encountering guantong here as a description of Joe's relationship to reading, It felt like an embodiment or enactment of Benjamin's Verspannung. Such translucency between otherwise unrelated texts is a rare moment. Readers might simply pass by and continue following the storyline without even noticing my allusion or tribute to Benjamin. But this does not matter at all. You can read Can Xue on so many different levels of depth, and all of them are equally rewarding. As we are enjoying these summer days in the charming chateau, with its shady garden and breathtaking lake and mountain views, I would like to close with a passage from Can Xue's very first autobiographical story, Summer Sun in the Beautiful South. Ich wage zu behaupten, dass in jedem meiner Texte ein helles Strahlen ist, das durch alle Zeichen und Zeilen leuchtet. Und ich möchte noch einmal unterstreichen, es ist die glühende Sonne im schönen Süden, die meine Schöpfungskraft entfacht. I dare to say that in all my texts there's a bright radiance shining through every character and line, and I want to emphasize once more, it is the glowing sun of the beautiful South that sparks my creative power.